Episode 1, The Discovery, October 16th, 1962, 7 in the morning, the White House. A manila envelope rests on President John F. Kennedy's desk. Inside, aerial photographs taken 2 days earlier by a U-2 spy plane over the island of Cuba. Blurry black and white images show something that shouldn't be there. Launch pads for medium-range ballistic missiles. Soviet missiles. Nuclear-capable missiles. Just 144 kilometers off the coast of Florida. Kennedy stares at the photographs in silence. His tanned, youthful face tightens. He knows what this means. He knows the world has just changed. In 30 minutes, those missiles could wipe Washington, New York, and Miami off the map. 80 million Americans would be dead before noon. The Cold War, the ideological confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union that has dominated the world since the end of World War II, has just heated up. Very hot. Kennedy picks up the phone. He calls an emergency meeting. Only a handful of men will know what's happening. The world will continue with its routine, unaware that humanity has just stepped into the abyss. But how did those missiles get to Cuba? Why did Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, decide to challenge the United States so directly? To understand, we must go back a year and a half to a beach in southern Cuba and an invasion that changed everything. April 17th, 1961. Bay of Pigs, Cuba. The sun is just beginning to rise over the Caribbean when 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and financed by the CIA, land on Cuban beaches. Operation Pluto, a secret plan approved by Kennedy just 3 months after taking office, seeks to overthrow Fidel Castro's revolutionary government. But everything goes wrong, terribly wrong. Castro had been warned. His forces were waiting. Cuban warplanes destroyed the supply ships before they could unload ammunition. Paratroopers landed in swamps. The supposed popular rebellion against Castro never occurred. In less than 72 hours, the invasion was crushed. More than 1,200 men were captured. 144 died on the beaches. For Kennedy, it's a political catastrophe. For Castro, it's a monumental propaganda victory. For Khrushchev, it's an opportunity. The young American president, the Soviet leader believes, is weak. He can be intimidated. He can be pressured. Castro, convinced that the United States would try to invade again, pleaded for Soviet protection. And Khrushchev saw more than just an opportunity to defend a communist ally in the Western Hemisphere. He saw a way to balance the nuclear balance. Moscow, spring of 1962. Deep within the Kremlin, Khrushchev studies military maps with his generals. The numbers are stark and devastating. The United States has an overwhelming nuclear advantage. More than 5,000 nuclear warheads against just 300 Soviet ones. Worse still, the United States has deployed Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, aiming directly at Soviet cities. Moscow is only 16 minutes away from being annihilated. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction only works if both sides have a real retaliatory capability. But the Soviet Union is at a disadvantage. Its intercontinental missiles are primitive and unreliable. They cannot reach American soil with certainty. Then Khrushchev has a bold, dangerous, brilliant idea. If he can't threaten the United States from Soviet territory, he'll do it from the American backyard. From Cuba, in May, he secretly proposed to Castro the deployment of 40R, 12 and R-14 nuclear missiles on the island, as well as IL-28 bombers, 42,000 Soviet troops, and conventional weapons. Castro accepted, not only for protection, but for ideological reasons. It would be the first Latin American territory to host Soviet nuclear weapons, a beacon of anti-imperialist resistance. Operation Anadir begins in July. Soviet ships cross the Atlantic with cargo classified as agricultural equipment. The missiles travel in the holds, hidden under tarpaulins. The deception is massive. The risk, incalculable. October 14, 1962. At 3,200 meters above western Cuba, U.S. Air Force pilot Major Richard Hazer flies a Lockheed U-2, the world's most advanced spy plane. His mission, to photograph suspicious buildings reported by intelligence. The U-2 is a technological marvel. It flies so high that it's beyond the reach of most anti-aircraft systems. Its cameras can capture details from over 20 kilometers above the ground. For 6 minutes, Hazer flies over the San Cristobal region while the automatic cameras take 928 photographs. When the images are revealed in Washington, CIA analysts can't believe their eyes. They're clearly visible are the launch pads. Intelligence technicians compare them to captured Soviet manuals. There's no doubt they are SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles with nuclear capability. Range, 2,000 kilometers. Enough to reach from Cuba to any American city east of the Mississippi. But there's something worse. The platforms aren't yet fully operational. The Americans discovered the deployment just in time. Another week, maybe 2, and the missiles would have been ready to fire. Kennedy would have faced a fait accompli. On October 15th, the photographs reached National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy. The next day, they were on the president's desk. October 16th, 11:50 a.m. White House Situation Room. Kennedy urgently convenes a select group of advisors. They call it ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Only 14 men. Among them, his brother Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, Dean Rusk, Secretary of State, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, and General Maxwell Taylor, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Kennedy shows them the photographs. The room falls silent. For the next 6 days, this group will meet in secret, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. The president orders absolute secrecy. The world can't know. Not yet. If the news leaks out before they have a plan, it could trigger panic. Or worse, it could force Khrushchev to act first. The options are hotly debated. The military, especially General Curtis LeMay, commander of the Air Force, is pushing for a massive airstrike followed by a ground invasion. We must act forcefully and quickly, LeMay argues. Destroy the missiles before they become operational. Overthrow Castro once and for all. But Robert Kennedy poses a question that paralyzes everyone. What if an airstrike doesn't destroy all the missiles? What if only one survives and is launched at an American city? McNamara proposes a less violent alternative, a naval blockade. Surround Cuba with warships to prevent further Soviet supplies from reaching it. Buy time. Put diplomatic pressure on Khrushchev. Kennedy listens, takes notes, but he doesn't decide. Not yet. While the ExComm debates, Kennedy maintains his normal public schedule. Meetings with congressmen, official events, smiling for the cameras. No one can suspect that the president is considering decisions that could lead to World War III. While Washington secretly debates, the deployment continues in Cuba. Trucks transport nuclear warheads from the ports to the launch sites. Soviet technicians work day and night to make the missiles operational. Castro tours the facilities, excited. For him, these missiles are a guarantee of survival, a shield against U.S. imperialism. But they are also something more, a weapon of revenge. If the United States invades, Castro is prepared to use the missiles. He has told Khrushchev directly in coded messages. If the time comes, we must be prepared for the supreme sacrifice. In Washington, the CIA constantly updates its estimates. Photographs of the U-2 continue to accumulate. By October 20th, U.S. intelligence confirmed the presence of at least 40 missile platforms under construction. They also identified IL-28 bombers capable of carrying nuclear bombs. Time is running out. Analysts estimate the first missiles will be operational in less than a week. Kennedy knows he must act quickly, but how can he act without starting a nuclear war? During the ExComm meetings, McNamara presents a chilling fact. If the crisis escalates to a full-blown nuclear exchange, conservative estimates predict 150 million deaths in the United States. In the Soviet Union, 200 million. In Europe, another 100 million. More than 400 million human beings wiped out in a matter of hours. The price of error is, literally, the end of civilization. October 20th. After 5 days of exhausting debate, Kennedy makes his decision. There will be no airstrike. There will be no immediate invasion. The United States will impose a naval quarantine on Cuba. It's a carefully chosen euphemism. A blockade is technically an act of war under international law. A quarantine sounds less belligerent. The strategy is clear. Form a ring of warships around Cuba. Stop and inspect any vessel heading toward the island. Reject any cargo containing offensive military material. Give Khrushchev a diplomatic outlet while maintaining the pressure. But Kennedy knows this is also a gamble. If the Soviets defy the quarantine, if their ships try to cross the line, the Americans will have to fire on them. And that could be the first shot of World War III. That same night, Kennedy orders a televised address to be prepared. He will speak directly to the American people and the world. Secrecy can no longer be maintained. The crisis is about to become public. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Khrushchev still doesn't know that his secret operation has been discovered. Soviet ships continue sailing toward Cuba with more missiles, more warheads, and more equipment. They are just 2 days away from reaching Cuban waters. And there, somewhere in the Atlantic, the U.S. fleet is deploying to intercept them. October 22, 1962, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. 75 million Americans are in front of their televisions. Kennedy appears on screen, sitting behind his desk in the Oval Office. His expression is grave. "Good evening, my fellow countrymen," he begins. His voice is firm, but there is a palpable weight in every word. For 17 minutes, he reveals to the world what his government has kept secret for 6 days. He shows the photograph of the U-2. He explains the threat. He announces the naval quarantine. "It shall be the policy of this nation," it declares, "to regard any nuclear missile launch from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union against the United States, requiring full retaliation against the Soviet Union." It's an ultimatum. Clear, direct, terrifying. In Moscow, Khrushchev watches the translated broadcast. He's furious. He feels betrayed. He had trusted that the deployment would remain secret until it was too late for the United States to react. Now he's exposed, humiliated, and trapped. That night, the Soviet Union issued an official statement calling the U.S. quarantine piracy on the high seas and warning that its ships would not stop, that they would cross the line, across the world. Fear is gripping the population. American supermarket shelves are emptying as families stockpile food and water. Bomb shelters, long forgotten since the 1950s, are reactivated. In schools, children are practicing duck-and-cover drills, a ridiculously useless measure against thermonuclear weapons. In European capitals, leaders watch in horror. They know that if the United States and the Soviet Union exchange nuclear attacks, Europe will be devastated in a matter of minutes. Humanity holds its breath. October 24th, dawn. The Atlantic, an imaginary line drawn 80 kilometers off the Cuban coast, has become the most dangerous place on the planet. 19 Soviet ships are sailing toward Cuba. Most are cargo ships, but some are escort submarines. Submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes, although the United States doesn't know it yet. The U.S. Navy has deployed 180 ships to the area. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, cruisers. Thousands of sailors on high alert. The orders are clear. Stop any Soviet vessel attempting to cross the line. Board it. Inspect it. Use force if necessary. In the White House Situation Room, Kennedy and the ex-com monitor the movement of ships in real time through Navy reports. Each update comes like a medical bulletin from a patient on the verge of death. The Soviet ships are 50 kilometers from a quarantine line, McNamara reports. They are maintaining course and speed. The silence in the room is absolute. If the Soviets cross, the United States will have to act. If the United States fires on a Soviet ship, Khrushchev will have to respond. And then the abyss. 10 a.m. update. The Soviet ships have slowed. They are stopping. Robert Kennedy describes that moment in his memoirs. "We felt as if the air had been knocked out of the room. We stood on the edge of a precipice, looking down into the darkness of the nuclear abyss." The Soviet ships turn back. They don't cross the line. Not that day. Dean Rusk whispers a phrase that will become famous. We were looking right at each other, and I think the other guy just blinked. But the crisis isn't over. It hasn't even really begun, because the missiles are already in Cuba. And with each passing day, they're closer to being operational. October 26. While the naval quarantine keeps new Soviet shipments at bay, the real problem remains unsolved. The missiles already deployed in Cuba. The CIA updates its reports. Soviet technicians are working around the clock. Some launch sites could be operational within 48 hours. Kennedy feels the pressure from all angles. The military insists on a preemptive airstrike. Congress demands action. European allies fear being drawn into a war. And the clock is ticking. That night, Kennedy received an extraordinary cable from Moscow. It was a personal letter from Khrushchev, long, emotional, almost desperate. It came not through official diplomatic channels, but through secret contact with a Soviet journalist in Washington. In the letter, Khrushchev writes like a man who finally understands the magnitude of the danger he has unleashed. He speaks of the war as a rope that both leaders are stretching. If we stretch it too far, he writes, there will come a time when we can no longer let go, and then that rope will have to break. And that would be war. He proposes a deal. The Soviet Union will withdraw its missiles from Cuba if the United States publicly promises not to invade the island. It's a way out, an open door to peace. Kennedy and the ex-com analyze every word of the letter. Is it genuine, or is it a trap? Is Khrushchev speaking for himself, or is he being pressured by hawks within the Kremlin? While they deliberate, a second message arrives from Moscow. But this one is different. October 27th, the day that would later be remembered as Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev's second letter arrives through official channels and is radically different from the first. The tone is cold, formal, and demanding. He no longer simply asks for a promise not to invade Cuba. He now publicly demands that the United States withdraw its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. An explicit exchange, missiles in Cuba for missiles in Turkey. The ex-com is baffled. What changed in less than 24 hours? The most likely theory, hawks within the Kremlin pressured Khrushchev to toughen his position. Or perhaps the first message was the product of Khrushchev drinking too much vodka and being overcome by fear, while the second reflects the official position of the Politburo. Kennedy now faces an impossible dilemma. Publicly, he cannot agree to the missile exchange without appearing weak, without appearing as if the United States had caved into Soviet pressure. But privately, he knows that the Jupiter missiles in Turkey are obsolete and already scheduled for retirement. They are a reasonable bargaining chip. As the ex-com debates furiously, devastating news arrives from Cuba. AU-2 has been shot down over Cuban territory. The pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson, is dead. He was hit by a Soviet SA-2 surface-to-air missile. He is the first American killed in the crisis. The room explodes. The generals demand immediate retaliation. The rules of engagement authorize destroying SAM sites that fire on U.S. aircraft. An airstrike now seems inevitable. And everyone knows that an airstrike will lead to an invasion. And an invasion will lead to... Kennedy raises his hand. Not yet, he says. Not yet. But the president knows that time for decisions is running out. The hawks, both in Washington and Moscow, are taking control of the situation. That same night, in international waters near Cuba, something no one in Washington knows is about to happen. A Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine, harassed by U.S. destroyers dropping depth charges to force at the surface, finds itself trapped. Inside, the Soviet officers are at their wits' end. The submarine has been submerged for hours. The heat is unbearable. Carbon dioxide reaches dangerous levels. Communications with Moscow are cut off, and the submarine carries a nuclear torpedo. Captain Valentin Savitsky, believing the war has already begun, orders the nuclear torpedo to be prepared. He is ready to launch it at the American fleet. He only needs the consent of the other two officers on board to authorize the firing. Two say yes. One, Flotilla Officer Vasily Arkhipov, says no. And in that moment, as three men debate in a sweltering submarine in the Caribbean, the fate of humanity hangs by a thread thinner than anyone could imagine. Episode 2, The Man Who Saved the World. October 27th, 11 at night, 135 meters below the surface of the Caribbean, the Soviet submarine B-59 is a floating hell. The interior temperature exceeds 50 degrees Celsius. The air is thick, almost unbreathable. The sailors collapse from dehydration. Some lose consciousness. Captain Valentin Savitsky is at the limits of his mental endurance. For hours, American destroyers have pursued his submarine, dropping depth charges that explode near the hull. They aren't close enough to destroy it, but they are enough to terrify it. The sound is deafening, like giant hammer blows against metal. The Americans are trying to force the submarine to surface, but Savitsky doesn't know this. He believes they are under real attack. Even worse, the B-59 has been out of radio contact with Moscow for days. They have no idea what's happening in the outside world. Has the war already started? Have Soviet cities been attacked? They operate in a complete information vacuum, guided only by the last orders received before losing communication. Protect convoys heading for Cuba. Use all necessary weapons if attacked. And the B-59 carries a weapon no American destroyer would expect. A nuclear torpedo with a 10-kiloton warhead, 2/3 the power of the Hiroshima bomb. Savitsky is convinced that World War III has begun, that Moscow has probably already been destroyed, that they must fulfill their duty to the end. Prepare the special torpedo, he orders. The Soviet protocol for authorizing the use of a nuclear weapon on a submarine requires the unanimous consent of 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla officer. On the B-59, these men are Valentin Savitsky, Ivan Maslenikov, and Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov. Savitsky and Maslenikov agree. They must fire the nuclear torpedo, destroy the Americans attacking them, fulfill their mission, defend the Soviet Union. But Arkhipov is opposed. Vasily Arkhipov is a 36-year-old veteran, second in command of the small flotilla of submarines deployed near Cuba. He has real-world combat experience. Just 18 months earlier, in July 1961, he was aboard the nuclear submarine K-19 when its reactor suffered a critical failure. Arkhipov received a near-lethal dose of radiation, helping to prevent a complete core meltdown. Many of his shipmates died in the following months from radiation poisoning. He survived, but he knows better than most what it means to face annihilation. In the stifling compartment of the B-59, Arkhipov argues against the use of the nuclear torpedo. We don't know for sure that the war has started, he insists. We haven't received direct orders to attack. If we fire that torpedo, we'll unleash hell. Let's start World War III ourselves. The debate is fierce. Savitsky is on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Maslenikov supports the captain, but Arkhipov remains steadfast. Finally, Savitsky gives in. All right, he says bitterly. We'll emerge. The B-59 surfaces amidst the American fleet. Searchlights immediately illuminate it. It's humiliating, but they're alive. And the nuclear torpedo remains in its launch tube. None of the Americans present, none of the sailors on the destroyers, none of the officers in the Pentagon know that they have just narrowly avoided the start of a nuclear war. They won't know for decades that the Soviet submarines carried nuclear torpedoes. They won't know until 2002, when declassified documents reveal the truth, that a single man, Vasily Arkhipov, saved the world that night. While Arkhipov convinces his superiors not to launch the nuclear torpedo, in Washington, Robert Kennedy is saving the world in another way. October 27th, 9 p.m. Robert Kennedy, Attorney General and brother of the President, meets secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin in his office at the Justice Department. There is no official record of this meeting, no stenographers, just 2 men speaking with brutal candor about the survival of humanity. We have very little time, Robert tells Dobrynin. The pressures for military action against Cuba are immense. My brother can't hold back the military much longer. If we don't resolve this in the next 24 hours, we'll lose control of the situation. Then Robert makes an extraordinary proposal, something that will remain secret for years. If you remove the missiles from Cuba, we will remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey. But it has to be private. It can't look like a public exchange. Politically, my brother wouldn't survive. It's a deal brokered behind the scenes. An exchange that will save peace but can't be officially recognized. Dobrynin immediately relayed the message to Moscow. Khrushchev received it with relief. It was the way out he needed. He could present the missile withdrawal as a victory. It saved Cuba from a U.S. invasion and forced the United States to withdraw missiles from Soviet borders. No one needed to know that this last point was a secret agreement. October 28th, Sunday morning. Radio Moscow interrupts its regular programming. An official communique from the Soviet government is read live. The world listens with bated breath. The Soviet government, in addition to previously issued instructions regarding the cessation of work at the weapons sites in Cuba, has ordered the dismantling of the weapons you describe as offensive, their packaging, and their return to the Soviet Union. In Washington, Kennedy received news while attending Sunday, Massachusetts. He left the church knowing the immediate crisis had passed. That afternoon, he sent a formal response to Khrushchev accepting the terms. The United States would not invade Cuba. The Jupiter missiles would be removed from Turkey, although this was not mentioned publicly. The naval quarantine will remain in effect until the complete withdrawal of the missiles is verified, but the moment of greatest danger has passed. On the streets of American and European cities, people celebrate. Some weep with relief. Families who had packed emergency supplies unpack them. Children play again without the constant terror of air raid sirens. But not everyone celebrates. Havana. Fidel Castro was not consulted in advance about the agreement. He heard about it on the radio like the rest of the world. His fury is monumental. For Castro, this is a betrayal. The Soviets deployed the missiles in Cuba, supposedly to protect the revolution, but now they are withdrawing them without even asking his opinion. Even worse, the agreement includes UN inspections on Cuban territory to verify their dismantlement. Castro sees this as a violation of Cuban sovereignty, a humiliation. For days, Castro refused to cooperate with the inspections. He sent furious messages to Moscow. In one particularly revealing message, he admitted that during the crisis he had urged Khrushchev to launch a nuclear first strike against the United States if they invaded Cuba, even though he knew it would mean the destruction of Cuba itself. The sacrifice of our people would have been worth it, he wrote, if it contributed to the victory of world socialism. Khrushchev was horrified when he read this. He realized he had armed a leader bent on national suicide with nuclear weapons. Years later, Khrushchev would write in his memoirs, "Castro frightened me with his willingness to die. He had the mentality of a guerrilla, not a nuclear statesman." Relations between Cuba and the Soviet Union cooled for months. They eventually mended, but were never the same again. Cuba remained a Soviet ally, but Moscow would never again fully trust Castro with weapons of mass destruction. For Kennedy, the end of the crisis is a bittersweet victory. Publicly, he is hailed as a brilliant statesman who stood up to the Soviets and won. His approval rating soars to 75%. The world press describes him as a leader of the free world who saved peace without giving in to communist aggression. But privately, Kennedy knows the full truth. He was much closer to disaster than anyone imagined. He knows there were times when he lost control of the situation, when military commanders on both sides acted on their own initiative. He knows that luck played as much a role as strategy. And he knows that the secret missile deal in Turkey, if revealed, could destroy his presidency. For Khrushchev, the outcome is more complex. He is initially seen as a hero at home. He prevented war, saved Cuba, and forced American concessions. But over time, hawks within the Kremlin begin to view him as weak. Someone who challenged the United States and then backed down. Someone who gambled and lost. This perception would contribute to his downfall 2 years later, in October 1964, when he was removed from power in an internal party coup. His successors would cite the Cuban Missile Crisis as an example of his crazy schemes that endangered the Soviet Union. November 1962, with the missiles out of Cuba and the waters temporarily calm, both sides begin to analyze what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. The conclusion is terrifying. The world was minutes away from annihilation multiple times during those 13 days, and most of those critical moments occurred outside the control of Kennedy and Khrushchev. The B, 59 cases, just one. There are others. A bear that climbed a fence at a U.S. air base in Minnesota triggered an intruder alarm, nearly triggering the launch of nuclear fighters. A U.S. satellite detected what appeared to be a massive Soviet missile launch. It turned out to be the moon's reflection in the clouds. A radar officer in Duluth saw on his screen what he interpreted as Soviet bombers approaching Canada, only to discover it was a calibration error. Any of these incidents, combined with the extreme tension of those days, could have triggered an accidental nuclear exchange. Kennedy and Khrushchev were stunned by these revelations. Both leaders began looking for ways to reduce the risk of accidental war. The first measure was the installation of the red telephone, a direct line of communication between the Kremlin and the White House. It wasn't actually a telephone, but a telex system, but it allowed instant communication without going through slow diplomatic channels. Negotiations also begin to limit the proliferation of nuclear weapons, talks that will eventually lead to the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. While politicians and diplomats negotiate treaties, Vasily Arkhipov quietly returns to the Soviet Union. There are no parades for him, no medals for saving the world. In fact, his role in preventing the launch of the nuclear torpedo remains classified for decades. Arkhipov continued his naval career, eventually rising to vice admiral. He retired in 1985 and lived quietly in Moscow. He died in 1998 at the age of 72, without his name ever being known to the world. It wasn't until 2002, during a conference in Havana on the missile crisis, bringing together American, Soviet, and Cuban veterans, that the full story of the B-59 was revealed. Retired Captain Vadim Orlov, who was present on that submarine, publicly recounted for the first time how they came close to launching the nuclear torpedo and how Arkhipov stopped them. The director of the U.S. National Security Archive, Thomas Blanton, sums up the moment with chilling clarity. A guy named Arkhipov saved the world. Posthumously, Arkhipov is recognized as one of the great unsung heroes of the 20th century. But in October 1962, as the world celebrated the end of the crisis, he simply returned to his duty without a word of what he had done. For Cuba, the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis marks the beginning of a long period of isolation and hardship. The missiles leave, but the U.S. economic embargo remains in place and intensifies. Cuba becomes increasingly dependent on Soviet aid, oil, wheat, weapons, and massive subsidies. The Cuban economy transforms into a Cold War economy, artificially sustained by its alliance with Moscow. Kennedy keeps his promise not to invade Cuba, but the CIA continues covert operations to destabilize the Castro regime. The program, known as Operation Mongoose, includes assassination attempts, economic sabotage, and psychological warfare. None are successful. Castro, for his part, became more radical. He exported revolution to Latin America and Africa. Guerrillas trained in Cuba appeared in Colombia, Venezuela, and Bolivia. Che Guevara, Castro's second-in-command, set out to ignite revolutions in the Congo and later in Bolivia, where he was captured and executed in 1967. The Cuban Missile Crisis transformed Cuba from a small Caribbean country into a global symbol. For some, a bastion of resistance against imperialism. For others, an authoritarian regime supported by foreign powers. That identity will define Cuba for the next 60 years. December 1962. 2 months after the end of the crisis, Kennedy meets privately with his brother Robert at the White House. They discuss how close they came to the brink. If we had to do over again, Kennedy reflects, I don't know if we'd make the same decisions. We were lucky, Bobby. Very lucky. Robert nods. Years later, he would write a book about the crisis titled 13 Days, which would become the definitive account of those 2 weeks from an American perspective. But there's something Kennedy doesn't know, something that won't be revealed until decades later. In addition to 42 ballistic missiles the United States identified, the Soviets had deployed 162 tactical nuclear warheads in Cuba. Short-range nuclear weapons intended to be used against American troops if they invaded the island. If Kennedy had ordered the airstrike, an invasion the military was pushing for, U.S. forces would have been hit with nuclear weapons on the beaches. Tens of thousands of soldiers would have died instantly. And then, the escalation into a full-blown strategic exchange would have been virtually inevitable. Kennedy's decision to choose a quarantine over a military attack was not only smart, it was literally the difference between peace and apocalypse. November 22, 1963. 13 months after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas. He is 46 years old. The world mourns. Even Khrushchev sends a heartfelt message of condolence, calling Kennedy a man who showed great courage and sobriety during the darkest days. Kennedy's death closes a chapter in the history of the Cold War. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, will inherit many of the unresolved problems of the Kennedy era, especially Vietnam. But Johnson will not have the same flair for nuclear crisis management. Fortunately, he will never face a challenge similar to the 13 days of October in 1962. For those who lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy's death raises a haunting question. What would have happened if he had been assassinated during the crisis? What would have happened if Lyndon Johnson, inexperienced in foreign policy, had had to make those impossible decisions? What would have happened if the military, under a less confident president, had succeeded in their airstrike? These are unanswered questions, but they underscore how thin the line is between survival and annihilation when the fate of humanity depends on the decisions of few men under extreme pressure. But the story of the Cuban Missile Crisis doesn't end in 1963. There are secrets that will remain hidden for decades. There are heroes whose actions won't be known until the 21st century. And there are consequences that will shape the world for the next 30 years. Because while the world celebrated the end of crisis, no one knew that just 3 years later, the Soviet Union and the United States would once again be on the brink of nuclear war. This time, not in Cuba, but in the Middle East. And this time, there wouldn't be 13 days to negotiate. Just hour. Episode 3, The Secret Shadows. Moscow, 1992. 30 years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Soviet archives begin to open. The Soviet Union has collapsed. The Kremlin, now under Russian leadership, allows Western historians access to documents classified for decades for the first time. What they discover leaves even veterans of the crisis stunned. At a historic conference in Havana in 1992, former American, Soviet, and Cuban commanders meet to discuss what really happened in October 1962. Robert McNamara, the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, now 76, listens with growing horror as Soviet officials reveal details he never knew. We had 162 nuclear warheads in Cuba, says General Anatoly Gribkov, who had been in charge of the Soviet operation, not just the medium-range missiles you discovered. We also had tactical nuclear weapons, FKR, nuclear cruise rockets with a range of 180 kilometers, Luna, short-range rockets, all with nuclear warheads. McNamara blanches. Were they authorized to use them? He asks. Local commanders had prior authorization to use tactical weapons if a U.S. invasion cut off communications with Moscow. Gribkov replies. The room falls into absolute silence. McNamara understands the implications immediately. If the United States had invaded Cuba, as the military demanded, U.S. troops would have been hit with nuclear weapons almost immediately. The escalation of all-out nuclear war would have been instantaneous and inevitable. My God, McNamara whispers, we were so close. To fully understand the magnitude of the Soviet deployment in Cuba, we must go back to July 1962, when Operation Anadir began in secret. The name itself was a deliberate deception. Anadir is a city in the far northeast of Siberia, one of the coldest regions on the planet. Soviet soldiers recruited for the operation were given Arctic weather gear, fur coats, lined boots, skis. They were told they would be deployed to the Arctic for military exercises. 42,000 soldiers were embarked on 85 ships. They traveled in terrible conditions, confined in holds in unbearable heat as they crossed the tropical Atlantic. Many fell ill. Only when the ships approached Cuba were their true destination revealed to them. The deception worked perfectly. U.S. intelligence detected the increase in Soviet naval traffic toward Cuba, but interpreted it as shipments of defensive equipment, anti-aircraft weapons, conventional tanks, and ammunition. The idea that the Soviets would deploy nuclear weapons outside their territory for the first time in history seemed improbable, almost unthinkable. The missiles were transported in containers marked agricultural equipment. The nuclear warheads traveled separately in refrigerated ships. American U. Two reconnaissance planes photographed the Soviet ships but were unable to see the content of the holds. By the time Kennedy saw the first photographs of the launch pads on October 16th, the Soviets had completed 80% of the deployment, another month, and everything would have been operational before the United States even knew about it. But perhaps the most terrifying secret revealed decades later was that of the submarines. For Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines were deployed to escort convoys to Cuba and protect the island in the event of a U.S. invasion. The B-4B, 36B, 59, and B-130 each carried 22 conventional torpedoes, and each one carried a special nuclear torpedo with a 10-kiloton warhead. Soviet protocols for the use of these weapons were vague, almost non-existent. In theory, they required direct authorization from Moscow. But what if communications were cut off? What if the submarine was under attack and couldn't contact Central Command? Captains had operational discretion. If they believed war had begun, if they were under direct attack, they could use the nuclear torpedo to defend themselves. They only needed the consent of the 3 senior officers on board. During the crisis, the U.S. Navy deployed its full anti-submarine capability. They relentlessly tracked the 4 Soviet submarines. They used practice depth charges, small explosives that wouldn't damage the submarines but would make a deafening noise, forcing them to surface. For the Soviet submariners, submerged, without communication, harassed by constant explosions, the experience was terrifying. Each of the 4 submarines, at different times, considered using its nuclear torpedo. B-59, where Archipov prevented the launch, was just one such case. The other 3 also came close. In each case, whether due to a commander's judgment, an officer's intervention, or simply exhaustion that led to the decision to surface rather than fight, the nuclear torpedo was not fired. For submarines, for nuclear torpedoes, for opportunities to start World War III. And no one in Washington had any idea they existed. While Kennedy was publicly negotiating with Khrushchev, another program continued in the shadows. Operation Mongoose, the CIA's plan to overthrow or assassinate Fidel Castro. The program had begun in November 1961, a year before the missile crisis. As a direct response to the Bay of Pigs failure, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, personally oversaw the operation with almost maniacal obsession. "My idea," he said at one meeting, "is to stir things up on the island with espionage warfare, sabotage, general rebellion, and the overthrow of the communist government." The CIA's plans to eliminate Castro were so elaborate they seemed like something out of a bad taste spy novel. Exploding cigars, fungus-tainted diving suits, poison pills delivered through mafia contacts, attempts to make his iconic beard fall out to publicly humiliate him. None of them worked. Castro outlived them all. But the program's existence had unexpected consequences. When the Soviets proposed deploying missiles in Cuba, part of Castro's argument for accepting them was that he needed protection against ongoing U.S. attempts to overthrow or kill him. This wasn't paranoia. The assassination plots were real and ongoing. Ironically, the CIA's assassination program helped create the very nuclear crisis that nearly destroyed the world. Castro felt he needed Soviet missiles precisely because the United States had demonstrated it would stop at nothing to eliminate him. During the ex-com meetings, Kennedy heard military proposals that, if implemented, would have guaranteed World War III. General Curtis LeMay, head of the Strategic Air Command, repeatedly pushed for a massive airstrike followed by an immediate invasion. LeMay was a World War II veteran, the architect of the firebombing of Tokyo that killed more than 100,000 civilians in a single night. He was a man who believed in overwhelming force and who despised diplomacy as weakness. This is almost as bad as the Munich appeasement. LeMay told Kennedy directly in one meeting, comparing the president's response to Chamberlain's policy toward Hitler. It was a deliberate insult, and Kennedy knew it. But Kennedy resisted. Despite pressure from nearly his entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, despite accusations of weakness, despite the political risk, Kennedy chose the option that allowed more time for diplomacy. Secret recordings of the ex-com meetings, revealed years later, show a president consistently resisting the urge toward immediate military action. Again and again, Kennedy asks, "What next? What if that doesn't work? What will we do then?" It was the question the generals didn't want to answer, because the honest answer was total nuclear war. Decades later, McNamara would reflect on this moment. It wasn't brilliance that saved us. It was the good fortune of having a president who had the courage to stand up to his own military, and the good fortune that Khrushchev, in the end, also chose peace over pride. While Kennedy and Khrushchev were negotiating a way out of the crisis, Fidel Castro was sending his own messages to Moscow, and these messages reveal a leader willing to sacrifice his own nation for the revolutionary cause. On October 27th, the night of Black Saturday, when pilot Rudolph Anderson was shot down over Cuba, Castro was convinced that a U.S. invasion was imminent. He wrote an urgent letter to Khrushchev, which was sent in code that same night. In the letter, Castro urged Khrushchev to consider a nuclear first strike against the United States if U.S. forces invaded Cuba. If they really carry out the brutal attack against Cuba, they are threatening, Castro wrote. That would be the moment to eliminate such a danger forever in an act of the most legitimate self-defense, however harsh and terrible the solution. In other words, if the United States invades, launch the missiles, start a nuclear war, destroy the United States, even if it means destroying Cuba and much of the world. When Khrushchev read this letter, he was horrified. He realized he had given nuclear weapons to a revolutionary leader who was willing to die for his cause, taking the world with him. Years later, during the Havana Conference in 1992, when this letter was publicly discussed, Castro defended his position. "We would have been willing to die to preserve the dignity of our country," he said. He showed no remorse. The American and Soviet veterans present were stunned. They realized they had been negotiating with a man who viewed national martyrdom as an acceptable option. The exchange of missiles in Turkey for missiles in Cuba was perhaps the best-kept secret of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and its concealment had political consequences that lasted for decades. Turkey's Jupiter missiles were obsolete by 1962. They were liquid-fueled, required hours to prepare for launch, and were vulnerable to a Soviet first strike. The United States had already planned to replace them with safer and more effective Polaris missile submarines. But publicly admitting that they were withdrawing as part of a deal with the Soviets would have been politically devastating for Kennedy. Republicans would have accused him of caving to communist pressure. NATO allies would have questioned the U.S. commitment to their defense. So the deal was carefully structured. The Soviets would publicly withdraw their missiles from Cuba. The United States would publicly promise not to invade Cuba. And then, 6 months later, it would quietly withdraw the missiles from Turkey, with no official connection to the Cuban crisis. Only Robert Kennedy, Soviet Ambassador Dobrynin, and a handful of the president's closest advisors knew about the full agreement. Not even the majority of the ex-com was informed. The secret was kept secret for 25 years. It wasn't until 1987, when the ex-com recordings began to be declassified, that the full truth emerged. By then, the official story had solidified. Kennedy had faced the Soviets and won without concessions. The revelation of the Turkey deal qualified that narrative, showing that the resolution was more complex, more compromised, more realistic than the myth suggested. June 20th, 1963. 8 months after the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Moscow-Washington hotline, popularly known as the Red Telephone, is established. Despite its name, it's not a telephone. It's a telex system that directly connects the Kremlin to the Pentagon, allowing instant written communication between the leaders of both superpowers. The system uses 2 redundant circuits, one via cable through Finland, London, and Copenhagen, and the other via radio link through Tangier. The need for this line became painfully clear during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Messages between Kennedy and Khrushchev had taken hours, sometimes more than 12 hours, to be transmitted, translated, and delivered through normal diplomatic channels. In a nuclear crisis where missiles could cross the Atlantic in 30 minutes, such delays were potentially fatal. The first test message sent by Washington is appropriately mundane. The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. A pangram to test all the letters of the alphabet. The Soviet response is poetic. How beautiful the sky is in summer. The red telephone was never used to prevent a nuclear war during the Cold War, but was used several times for urgent communication in times of crisis. During the Six-Day War in 1967, the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. Its very existence changes the dynamics of the Cold War. Now leaders can speak directly in times of crisis, without relying on ambassadors, translators, or slow diplomatic channels. It's a small technical improvement with enormous implications for human survival. August 5, 1963. The Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty is signed simultaneously in Moscow, Washington, and London. It prohibits nuclear testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. It only permits underground testing. It is the first arms control agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union, and it is a direct offshoot of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy sees the treaty as his personal legacy. In a speech in June, 2 months before the signing, he spoke eloquently about the need for peace. What kind of peace do we seek? Not a Pax Americana imposed on the world by American weapons of war. Not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. I speak of genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living. It's a remarkable speech, delivered by a president who was willing to use nuclear weapons just 8 months earlier if necessary. Khrushchev also fervently supports the treaty. He has seen the abyss up close and doesn't want to go near it again. But his support for the treaty is used by hawks within the Kremlin as evidence that he has gone soft, that he has lost his revolutionary fire. The treaty entered into force on October 10, 1963. By then, more than 500 atmospheric nuclear tests had contaminated the planet with radioactive fallout. The treaty halted this contamination, saving countless lives from cancer and birth defects in the decades to come. It's a small step. France and China refused to sign and continue their own atmospheric tests for years. But it's a start, a crack in the logic of mutually assured destruction. While politicians sign treaties and diplomats celebrate peace, there are silent victims of the Cuban Missile Crisis who never appear in history books. Soviet sailors on the Foxtrot-class submarines returned home with severe medical conditions. The extreme conditions they were subjected to, temperatures of over 50 degrees Celsius, dangerous levels of carbon dioxide, extreme dehydration, leave permanent scars. Several develop chronic heart problems. Some suffer psychological disorders from the trauma of having been on the brink of starting a nuclear war. Vasily Arkhipov, the man who saved the world, never fully recovered from the radiation exposure he suffered in the K-19 accident a year earlier. Although he lived until 1998, his health was compromised for decades. Many of his fellow K-19 members were not so lucky. They died of cancer and organ failure caused by radiation in the following years. In Cuba, Soviet technicians who work with nuclear warheads without adequate protection also pay a price. The Soviet Union did not have the same radiation safety standards as the United States. Many of these men developed cancer decades later, never fully understanding the connection to their service in Cuba. And in the United States, the families of reconnaissance pilots like Rudolph Anderson, the only American killed during the crisis, are left wondering whether his sacrifice was necessary. Anderson was shot down because Soviet anti-aircraft commanders in Cuba acted without authorization from Moscow in a moment of confusion and panic. It was an accidental death in a crisis rife with near-fatal accidents. His widow, Jane Anderson, receives the Silver Star distinction on her husband's behalf. But no medal can bring a father back his 2 young children. These are the human faces behind the strategic decisions. The men and women who paid the personal price of a crisis they didn't create, but in which they found themselves trapped. For decades after the crisis, historians debate exactly what happened during those 13 days. Participants publish memoirs that often contradict each other. The XCOM recordings are helpful, but they capture only the formal meetings, not the private conversations, the secret agreements, or the moments in corridors and offices where crucial decisions were made. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War began to thaw, the Soviet archives began to open. Russian and Western historians collaborated for the first time, comparing documents from both sides. What they discover is both fascinating and terrifying. Both sides misinterpreted the other's intentions at crucial moments. Kennedy thought Khrushchev had complete control over the Soviet forces in Cuba. This wasn't true. Local commanders had considerable autonomy. Khrushchev thought Kennedy was bluffing with the threat of invasion. This wasn't true. Invasion plans were fully prepared, and U.S. forces were ready to execute them. The crisis was a dance of misunderstandings, with each side interpreting the other's signals through its own fears and assumptions. That it ended in peace was as much a product of chance as of diplomatic skill. In 2000, the CIA declassified additional documents that reveal how close Kennedy came to ordering the airstrike. On October 27th, Black Saturday, Kennedy had decided that if another American plane was shot down, he would order retaliatory strikes against Cuban anti-aircraft sites. This would have been the first step toward a full military escalation. Fortunately, no other plane was shot down. Luck, once again, saved the world. But there's one document that remains classified until 2012, 50 years after crisis. When it's finally declassified, it reveals something that changes the historical understanding of the entire event. It's a CIA intelligence report dated October 12, 1962, for days before Kennedy saw the U-2 photographs. The report contains information from a human agent in Cuba, a Cuban officer working for the CIA. The report describes long-range missile sites under construction in western Cuba. The CIA had human intelligence on the missiles 4 days before the aerial photographs, but the report was considered unconfirmed and didn't reach the president's desk until after photographs verified it. What would have happened if that report had been taken seriously immediately? What if Kennedy had had 4 more days to prepare a response? Or would it have made things worse, given the Hawks more time to push for military action? And there's something else in that declassified document, something historians almost overlooked at first. The code name of the Cuban agent who provided the information, Amlash. Amlash was Rolando Cubalacicades, a Cuban army commander close to Castro. And the CIA wasn't just using him for intelligence. They were also actively recruiting him to assassinate Fidel Castro. The same day Amlash reported on the missiles, he also met with CIA officers to discuss plans to kill Castro, which means that while Kennedy was negotiating to avoid nuclear war, his own intelligence agency was running operations that, if discovered, could have triggered exactly the war he was trying to prevent